Alright, so we're starting our next unit on quadrilaterals. So you have your new orange divider that you're gluing into your notebook after our unit on similar figures. And topic 1 is quadrilateral vocabulary. So take a second and write that in on your divider. Alright, so then across from that, you're going to glue in your page with your quadrilateral vocab. So up at the top, we're going to first talk about what a quadrilateral is. So we've come up with some ideas in class. It is definitely a type of shape, and you want to focus on the first part of the word quad. So that like prefix, quad means 4. So a quadrilateral is going to have not only 4 sides, but 4 angles as well. So quadrilaterals are closed two-dimensional figures. So closed figure just means that if you had, for instance, if you had like a W, that would have 4 sides, but it would not be closed. So you could have 4 sides that are closed, like a rectangle or a square or anything else where it closes back around. So it's a closed two-dimensional figure, nothing 3D here, with 4 sides. The sum of all the measures of the angles of a quadrilateral, instead of adding up to 180 like they do for a triangle, are going to add up to 360 degrees. And if you ever forget that, you can think about quadrilaterals that you know, are very familiar with, and what their angles are. So if you think about a square or a rectangle, each of those, if I go back to my rectangle here, it's not a fabulous rectangle, but these are supposed to be right angles here. It has 4 right angles. Each of these right angles is 90 degrees. So 90 degrees times 4 is going to give you 360 degrees. So if you ever forget, just think about a square or rectangle. 90 degrees times 4 angles is 360. But every quadrilateral, not just squares and rectangles, will have the sum of all their angles add up to 360. It's different for other shapes. If you had 5 sides, 6 sides, your total for your angle measures would be greater than this. But quadrilaterals is what we're focusing on for this unit. So a polygon. A polygon is basically a shape. Again, it is a closed figure. With at least 3 sides. It would have to have 3 sides or it could not be a closed figure. That do not cross. So it has to have at least 3 sides, it's a closed figure, and the sides do not cross each other. So the rest of this vocabulary, you're going to need to understand what it means in this unit as we talk about the different characteristics of our different quadrilaterals. So if you don't know what the words mean, it's hard for you to identify those characteristics. Some of them we've already talked about with our unit on similar figures. You're going to see some of the congruent markings on your shapes with congruent angles and sides. But there's also some new stuff we're going to add in this unit. One of them being parallel. So parallel means, and you may have heard this before, it is when it's 2 lines that never intersect. That means even if I were to extend the lines, they would not cross each other. So these 2 lines would be an example of parallel lines. Kind of like railroad tracks, like the metal part of the railroad tracks, not the wooden slats that go across. But the metal rails, they would never cross each other. Even if I extended the lines, they wouldn't cross. So when you have your shapes that you're going to see in this unit, there is notation that is drawn on the shapes to indicate that those lines are parallel, so that you're not just kind of guessing or trying to eyeball it. So if you see lines that are parallel, they're going to have these little, looks kind of like a greater than sign or like 2 little arrows drawn on the line, okay? So maybe if you have your rectangle, you have little arrow on the top side of the rectangle and this little arrow on the bottom side, meaning these two are parallel to each other. They have the same number of markings, same number of arrows on it, so they're parallel to each other. And they don't necessarily have to be the same length, but they're parallel. Then for instance, if you have another set of sides that are parallel, maybe your vertical sides now in your rectangle, you would have like two little triangles. And so maybe the left side of the rectangle has those two little triangles, and maybe the right side of the rectangle has those two little triangles, meaning these are parallel to each other. So you should not see all four sides of your shape having just one arrow on the parallel symbol, because that means they're all parallel to each other, which isn't possible. You cannot have four parallel sides on a quadrilateral because they cannot all be parallel to each other. You can have pairs of parallel sides, but you can't have four that are all parallel to each other. You just have four straight lines. So when you see this notation or those markings on a shape, it means that those lines or those sides are parallel to one another. Now kind of the opposite of parallel is perpendicular. So these lines not only cross, but they intersect at a specific angle. So lines that are perpendicular, it's two lines that intersect or cross to form right angles. And of course, a right angle is 90 degrees. So it's like the opposite of parallel. Parallel, they never cross. Perpendicular, when they cross, they actually form a right angle. So this symbol would mean, it's kind of like an upside down capital T. That means, that's like the symbol for perpendicular. And if you see it, on a shape, them notating that something is perpendicular. For instance, I'm going to draw that rectangle again. And you see those little squares normally in the corners of your rectangle, indicating that right angles are formed at these corners. So the left side is perpendicular to the bottom side, or the left side is perpendicular to the top side. The right is perpendicular to the bottom because they form a right angle there. You could also see lines that cross, and I'll do my best to make this look like it crosses at a 90-degree angle. You could see lines like that that cross, maybe going through the shape. It doesn't necessarily have to be within a quadrilateral. It could be not one of the sides, but it could be in the middle, something we'll talk about later. Or if you just see lines across like this, it means that this forms a right angle. And if this forms a right angle, actually the angle across from it and each of those side angles would also be 90 degrees as well. So we've seen the word congruent before. We've seen congruent in our similar figures unit. Basically means the same measure. When we were talking about shapes being congruent, we said they're the same shape and the same size. If we're talking more specifically about sides and angles, like you'll see more in this unit, being congruent means they're the same measure. If they're congruent in their angles, they have the same degree measure. If they're sides, they have the same length. And the symbol again for congruency is that equal sign with a squiggle above it. So that means is congruent to, if you see it written in a statement. So line of symmetry is probably new. Line of symmetry means basically if I could fold something, in half, and I'm going to use an extra one of these dividers as an example. I could take this divider that I have here and I could fold it in half. Okay? This would create a line of symmetry right here, so that what's on the left is the same as what's on the right. They're the same size, they would be identical, and it would actually be a mirror image. So I could draw, if I had like heart, that would be a line of symmetry through the heart because it would be a mirror image. Now, if I were to take This is going to mess up my heart a little bit. But in terms of my rectangle, I could take this and fold it this way. My heart doesn't have a line of symmetry going through it, but the paper does. So this would be a line of symmetry through my rectangle. If I were to fold this way, corner to corner, this is not a line of symmetry because my triangles don't line up. So that's one of the things we're going to be talking about in this unit is which shapes have how many lines of symmetry, different characteristics of our different shapes involving that, how you can fold it. So line of symmetry, it is going to divide a figure into two congruent parts that create a mirror image. Divide a figure into two congruent parts to create a mirror image. They do not necessarily have to be just horizontal and vertical. So in this case, we'll write in parentheses, not just horizontal and vertical. Those are the ones we think of most frequently. And those tend to work with more shapes, but you can have lines of symmetry at different angles, like at diagonals. Which takes us on to our next vocab word, so diagonals. A diagonal is a line segment. So the difference between a line and a line segment, a line technically goes on forever, infinitely in both directions, just like a number line. A line segment has an end point. So when we're dealing with shapes, the sides are really line segments, not lines, because they don't go on infinitely in either direction. So diagonal is a line segment that connects two opposite vertices. Which are basically your corners of your shape. So I'll put that in parentheses. So a line segment that connects two opposite corners or two opposite vertices. They're the lines that go diagonally through your shape, basically. Bisect. So bisect, if you think of any words that could sound similar to bisect. In one class somebody said dissect, like to dissect a bug or an animal. Or bicycle starts with the same prefix as bisect. So the prefix bi means two. Like bicycle, there are two wheels on a bicycle. But you can also think about dissect, which means like to cut or to cut something open. So if something is going to bisect a shape, it is going to divide or cut it into two equal parts. Now opposite we've used a bunch already on this page. When we're dealing with this unit, we're talking about opposite sides or opposite angles. Those are going to be across from each other. So when we're talking about opposite in this unit, it's more in terms of their placement in relation to something else, not opposite in terms of like good and bad, or opposites like that. Somebody was giving me examples of different shapes before, and those are not opposite. We're talking about like the placement of one side compared to another side, or an angle compared to another angle. So they are across from each other. So opposite sides would be like the top and the bottom sides of a rectangle. Those are opposite each other. And opposite angles, again, would be not next to each other, but across from each other. And we're going to add one more word down at the bottom here, which is adjacent. So adjacent means like the opposite of opposite. Angles are sides that are opposite or across from each other. Angles are sides that are adjacent to one another or next to each other. So if you don't know what that terminology means, again, it might be hard for you to identify what shape is being described from its characteristics if you don't know the difference between those words.